The GameCube deserved more. It's a statement often said by fans of the platform to indicate their dissatisfaction or confusion with the console's performance. And it makes sense, at first at least. The GameCube had some good games on it: Luigi's Mansion, Metroid, Pikmin, Zelda, Resident Evil. It definitely had a library larger than the N64, the gap between mini DVDs and DVDs was smaller than it was between cards and CDs, and the games on it flat out ran smoother and had some pretty creative ideas. And so within this discussion of GameCube related things, people often wonder, why did it fail? That is what I want to explain, because it is really complicated, and if anything, the GameCube kinda felt like the real PS2 competitor, at least in that generation. I mean, think about it. The Dreamcast blew its load too early, the Xbox was new and past the killer app of Halo, it basically just had a second-rate Western PS2 library, with a couple PC exclusives thrown in like Morrowind to Half-Life 2. But the GameCube felt so close to the PS2. In many ways, it was proclaimed as the more powerful system, at least on paper, and far more GameCube games did run in 480p, while a lot of PS2 games ran in 480i. It's not that much worse in the grand scheme of things, but you'll definitely notice the softer video output on most systems, especially if you don't have a good upscaler. And so, looking back at it, especially considering how much closer mini DVDs were to DVDs and that you could pack in multiple of them, like, it makes sense that maybe those DVDs had an impact, but surely it wasn't an impact this large, you know? Because not only did the GameCube sell worse compared to the PS2 than the N64 sold compared to the PS1, it also just flat out sold 11 million units less. Why was that the case? There are a few pretty surface-level claims that people like to toss about in these discussions, mainly piracy and the fact that people didn't buy it to play games on it and instead purely for DVD playback. So, let us cover those first because neither are accurate. For piracy, we should take a look at the amount of how many games sold on the PS2 and GameCube. Specifically, if we look at the official math just from the sales numbers, it turns out that both the PS2 and GameCube owners had about a ratio of 9 to 10 games per system. What does this mean? Well, it means that if we completely exclude piracy, official games only, they were evenly matched in terms of how many games people bought per system. Does this mean there was no piracy on the PS2? God no. Mod chips released before the PS2 was even out in the West. Most GameCube mod chips only came around in 2005 or so. But that doesn't mean people bought the system for piracy. If they did, we would see a lot less PS2 games sold per system compared to GameCube games. Of course, this official game sales data also doesn't account for people buying stuff like used games, but that's besides the point. While piracy definitely was a decent chunk of the PS2's total identity, it definitely wasn't a reason why people bought it specifically. The second claim of DVD playback is interesting, mostly because of how it's used in arguments. It's dismissive towards the PS2 to proclaim people only bought it due to its DVD playback capabilities. This statement obviously isn't true, considering the last point I made where both sold a similar amount of games per console, but like, it's pretty fair to say the GameCube was less interesting because it had no DVD playback. That's because DVD playback was an extra feature people wanted. That's a good thing. When people discuss consoles, they love to deride those extra features that weren't strictly gaming related, when in reality, many of those features, especially back in the day, were absolute godsends. If you were interested in Blu-rays, you would know that when the PS3 launched, it was basically the cheapest Blu-ray on the market, and it also played DVDs, obviously. Extra features may seem stupid from hindsight, especially with stupid ones like the Kinect being bundled with Xbox One units, but providing more features, more value, that's strictly a positive. And considering Sony basically owned a chunk of the DVD and Blu-ray name, it makes sense they would include it. The PSP being able to play UMD movies, or I guess the GBA playing those shitty GBA videos, isn't seen as much of a negative thing though, funnily enough. I wonder why, considering that these are special proprietary formats you have to buy, as opposed to just playing DVDs or Blu-rays. Regardless, now that we've gotten those two big arguments out of the way, what are we left with? Well, the hardware and library are next, and first, the performance debate is definitely interesting. Not to dwell too much on the technical stuff, but the PS2 was not strictly slower than the GameCube. It's complicated, like very, very complicated, but for a non-technical perspective, the PS2 was a lot more difficult to program for, and on paper slower. The PS2's architecture was designed in a way where there was basically little to no waiting between steps, and many things could be done in parallel. That is why many PS2 games could render way more polygons per frame than GameCube games did. Traveler's Tales had a particle engine that rendered over 17 million polygons per second alone, not even counting the main game and how many polygons it had. The very best GameCube games could hit maybe 12 million polygons total, though it had an overall better graphical feature set, which the PS2 could only counter in software, which was obviously harder to implement. The PS2 also had a third more system and video memory, though the GameCube had audio and I/O memory combinations of 4 times what the PS2 did, and that memory could not be accessed directly in the same way the main memory could, meaning that it was actually difficult to utilize it. When you add all of that up, the lines of which console was faster stop being so clear, with the GameCube coming with generally less storage and memory, while the PS2 was more difficult to dev for, and many games ran only in 480i instead of 480p due to memory constraints on the GPU's side of things because of the streaming architecture. But past that, overall, it was basically on par, and the games were usually on par with each other. Of course, people will argue over the ports. RE4 looks worse than PS2, though it does pack in a tiny bit more content. Sonic ran like absolute dog shit on the PS2. But then True Crime NYC run better on PS2. Need for Speed Underground did as well. Why is this? Well, because these games were made for one system, and then ported to the other system with relatively limited time constraints and/or budgets. There's more to this from the developer's perspective. At least one developer in the Beyond 3D forums, which are sadly privated now, had a significant negative experience with the GameCube, because basically, with the GameCube, you get good initial performance, and then that's it. No amount of dicking around will get you better performance. The PS2 in general was like a pain in the ass because poor implementations were really, really bad, and the Xbox was underutilized because it just wasn't popular enough for people to really bother. The reason why most developers ran their games at 480i on the PS2 was basically because they just couldn't be bothered engineering better streaming setups for their textures. That would basically allow them to use both high-quality textures and 480p. And of course, some developers did do this, because GT4 is a great example, but this aspect could have been worked on more if developers wanted to, but of course, with time and budget constraints, 480i is what a lot of developers settled on. And don't take this as developers being lazy or whatever. They had deadlines to hit, you know. Blame the management. The devs of Sonic 06 weren't the ones who decided to launch the game unfinished. The management decided it. It's always their fault. Another thing is the RAM. On the GameCube, you only had 24 megabytes of it, but hey, it was low latency, even though the CPU's huge cache basically nullified most of its advantages. It was basically a huge overreaction to the N64's latency woes, and there's just so much random shit that was just kind of a bit tedious when you're working on the GameCube. Like, God forbid you have to clip a polygon. Combine those woes with the fact that the GPU really didn't push as many polygons as you'd want to, and it's really difficult to call it superior to the PS2, but it's also basically impossible to call the PS2 superior to it. Oh, but there's also the little side thing where performance doesn't sell a console because the Xbox was right there, and though it sold a tiny bit better than the GameCube, it didn't sell very well. Of course, yeah, performance doesn't really matter. The DS and PSP are great examples. Both systems sold extremely well. The PSP's far superior performance, better controls, better screen, and larger game sizes made it sell a little over 80 million units. The DS sold over 150 million. That's because a games console is a lot more than just hardware. It's also the software. And just like how the DS appealed to more people, the same was true with the PS2. So when the hardware debate dies down, the accessories are brought up. And I'm not gonna go over the controller differences in depth, but the button layout, the tiny C-stick, the bad D-pad, shoulder button travel depth, the lack of ZL, select, and clickable buttons all basically contributed to the GameCube controller being seen more of as a Fisher-Price toy than an actual controller. The colors also didn't help. The PS2 controller, while it wasn't perfect, was a perfectly adequate and inoffensive controller, even if all buttons were analog for whatever reason. But then people will discuss the surface level stuff, like the GBA adapter, the Game Boy Player, the Wavebird, and some other stuff. None of these really mattered, nor did they push the needle forwards. The Game Boy Player never released any official sales records, but one Redditor says that it's like 200 to 300k. I think that's roughly fair. But regardless, those weren't the big things. Take the LAN adapter. Only Phantasy Star Online actually used the internet, while Mario Kart, Kirby Air Ride, and 1080 Avalanche used LAN play. Okay, let's see how the PS2 LAN and hard drive adapter performed, and oh, it's a bloodbath. Because it turns out, quite a few games use this. Okay, not a lot of games really use the hard drive. Final Fantasy XI and SOCOM were the only games that really use it for like updates and extra stuff, though some other games also use it for like faster loading times, some saved extra stuff to it like The Sims, and then there were some Japanese games that did some stuff to it, but that doesn't matter. Now, the PS2 games that did internet stuff, that's a far larger number. First, you have the MMOs, you know, Final Fantasy XI, obviously, Dart Hack, EverQuest, Champions of Norath, Monster Hunter, that sort of stuff. I'm pretty sure a lot of these have fan-run servers these days. Final Fantasy XI, the PS2 version, I think is still dead, but the other ones have, I think, fan-run stuff. Also, there was a shocking amount of sports and racing games that supported it. Then Battlefield, COD, similar games all had online support. A bunch of fighting games, tactical shooters like SOCOM were basically built off of online play more than anything else, really. Even MGS3 had it, and a lot of these, again, have revival servers. Also, many more games like the Armored Core games supported LAN play. GT4 also supported it. Kinda crazy nobody talks about it. But as we're listing off how much use these adapters had, I think that we should look at the games in general, and not just the games which used individual features. And of course, when the game arguments start, they go in one of two directions. Either the launch titles, or arguing over the same 10 games ad nauseum. So let's cover the launch titles first. For the GameCube, I'll count the games that weren't exclusively released on launch day, but were right before Christmas, as that's when many GameCube owners would have received their first console. Because the children. You had Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Super Monkey Ball, Wave Race Blue Storm, Animal Crossing, Smash Bros. Melee, and Rogue Squadron 2 from the exclusives. Then you had ports like Crazy Taxi, Pro Skater, some sports games, and SSX Tricky. It's not that bad of a lineup. What was the launch lineup of the PS2? Doesn't matter, because that was last year. The GameCube is not competing with the launch lineup. It is competing with the current lineup. Once Nintendo's console hit store shelves, Sony had way more than just a launch lineup ready. And while I could try listing the games, there's a rather famous image I can just show you instead. The Fall and Holiday 2001 exclusive software titles list: Ace Combat 4, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, Gran Turismo 3, GTA 3, Ico, Jak and Daxter, Metal Gear Solid 2, and Silent Hill 2. Oh, and don't worry, there were way more than 10 games. And many of these games were available well before the GameCube even released. GT3 released around April and July, depending on the region. Devil May Cry was in August. While we can argue with the impact of Melee, the fact that Luigi's Mansion, Animal Crossing, and Pikmin were good, even if they are outshined by Sunshine and Wind Waker, pardon the stupid pun, we can also talk about the underrated gems like Rogue Squadron 2 and Super Monkey Ball. Maybe we could even discuss if the Crazy Taxi port was better than the Dreamcast version. But there's no way of getting around the fact that those 10 games absolutely mopped the floor with the GameCube ones. On its own, Gran Turismo 3 outsold Melee twice over. GTA 3 spawned an entirely new genre of games that are still popular to this very day. And that's just the key 10. There were so many more great games released in 2001. Soul Reaver 2, Twisted Metal Black, Red Faction, Burnout. From a modern day perspective, it seems like the GameCube had its own fair share of games, maybe not as many as the PS2, but still a lot. Except that this is from hindsight when we can see the entire library. Back during the launch window, the vast majority of these games were not even there. Even once some more key titles released, like Sunshine and Wind Waker, Twilight Princess wasn't there until the very end, neither was RE4, Pokemon XD, Mario the Thousand Year Door, Metroid Prime 2, Pikmin 2, Pokemon Colosseum, Crystal Chronicles, Double Dash, a lot of them actually. And especially from that perspective early on when it was unclear what the future was, it's clear why so many people picked out the PS2 over the GameCube. Because even at the point when many of those games I mentioned were available, the PS2's library was also larger, but exponentially so. So that's the launch titles covered. Now it's time to go for the second part of the debate. The console didn't have the game argument. You've seen it time and time and time again. It's very much an underdog argument because what you're saying is, sure, this other system had way more games, but it didn't have this one. And the reason for this is that market leaders will point to general trends, while the underdogs will just point to the exceptions to those trends. Things have weirdly reversed today, where many PS5 owners go, but the Switch 2 doesn't have Astrobot or Death Stranding 2. While the Switch 2 owners can point to the wide amount of games that are already running on the Switch 2, or the upcoming exclusive titles, or the one that already released. Of course, things are much more muted these days when even games like Cyberpunk or Rebirth run on basically everything, but during the 6th console generation, the systems really weren't that far apart technologically, but they were different enough to where bad ports were common. That's why the best counter-argument to this kind of the system didn't have this one specific game is you didn't need it. Because, clearly, if a system was successful without a game, it didn't need it. It's a chicken and egg sort of argument, but nonetheless an accurate one. The PS2 did not have Melee, Wind Waker, or Sunshine. Clearly, it didn't need them. It sounds like a lazy one-liner. No, it is a lazy one-liner. But it's true. The PS2's library was so vast and varied that not having a couple key Nintendo titles really didn't harm it. Of course, the more games the merrier. The system would have done a bit better if it had those, but here's something for you to remember. Take away the first-party games from Sony, and what's left? Quite a lot, unsurprisingly. Yeah, many beloved games like Ueda's work, Dark Cloud, and some other ones would be gone, but a ton of the key titles are still there. Do the same for Nintendo, and what's left? Resident Evil? The PS2's reputation was made not by Sony themselves, but by third-party developers who chose it over its competition. It didn't need to rely on its own first-party releases. And that's why they could be as experimental as Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. This is important because, well, Nintendo's huge first-party library is what people remember, partially because they were so stupid towards many third parties that they just abandoned them. A smaller library also definitely did help them, because it's the same company, the same few games, it's easy to keep track of. fanboys can concentrate around these few key titles, and since all of them were made by Nintendo, you got Nintendo fans. Compare that to the PS2, where people will argue over a Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Kingdom Hearts, Xenosaga, Persona and Shin Megami Tensei, Dark Cloud, Star Ocean, Suikoden, Rogue Galaxy, the Tales of Games Dot Hack, or others are the better PS2 RPGs or not. From an outsider, you may remember the first 5 games at most, but that's kind of it. And because of that, many PS2 fans would differentiate between themselves more depending on what games and publishers they like than just being a fan of the PS2. Overall, I'd argue that Nintendo fans greatly over-rely on the few key exclusive titles in most discussions, but especially within the discussions of the GameCube. Definitely way more than a lot of the other generations. Button Kaitos was good, but it wasn't necessary when the PS2 already had all of those other RPGs. Mario Sunshine would have been a nice to have on the PS2, except Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, Ape Escape, Rayman, Crash Bandicoot, Psychonauts, and a couple others already existed. It clearly didn't also need Mario, there was plenty of stuff to play. As good as Metroid Prime was, when you're already dripping with games like Red Faction, Time Splitters, Killzone, Black Card, and more, Metroid is obviously nice to have, but it's not like there were no other shooters to play. And it's the same with many light RPG action-adventure games that were similar to Wind Waker. And when horror games are discussed, yeah, the PS2's port of RE4 looks worse, the RE1 remake isn't on PS2, Eternal Darkness isn't, but many YouTubers have made their entire careers playing exclusively PS2-era horror games. I think it's fair to say it has the advantage here. And of course, there are unique qualities to all of the games I've listed. It's why they're so beloved to this day. Even if I don't like Sunshine, Metroid is uniquely Metroid and something you can't just find on the PS2. I completely agree with you, but you also can't find something like Xenosaga, or something like Dot Hack, or something like GTA, or something like Gran Turismo on the GameCube. I mean, you sort of can in the sense that other games in the same ballpark kind of released, but nothing that could serve as a replacement to someone who likes those games specifically. There very much exist games that are in the same gist as Metroid, Sunshine, or Wind Waker, but the point is moot. The only thing that you can find both on the PS2 and GameCube are the cross-platform games. And even then, the argument from earlier is quite funny, because even though the PS2 version of RE4 looks worse, it sold more. Those shit-ass Sonic ports also sold more in PS2. And I mean, it makes logical sense. The larger platform will sell more games. Wii U fans continually sulk in the knowledge that many Wii U exclusives ended up outselling the damn Wii U once they got ported onto the Switch, a console people actually liked. So to compress this big, long point to one sentence, both systems had their unique titles. But for every key title the GameCube had, the PS2 had like 10 to 20 of them. Because of this, PS2 fans are more fans of specific games, when GameCube fans are more fans of the entire Nintendo thing. But there's also another absolutely huge reason to the fact many GameCube games felt less attractive to a lot of people. Many of them felt like upgraded N64 games. Some kind of magic or innovation just wasn't there. Like Sunshine, Double Dash, Wind Waker, Melee. All of them are great, except Sunshine, but all of them felt like upgraded versions of something that could have in some form been on the N64. It felt like an updated version of the same thing at a time when many game developers on the PS2 were trying to strive away from that. It just didn't wow consumers as much, especially when you compare that to the fact that none of the big IPs except Smash Bros. Were even available at launch, and the fact that, like, Final Fantasy X on the PS2 compared to the last ones finally had voice acting, in-game cutscenes that weren't pre-rendered. From a modern perspective, it seems whatever, but back then, it was a huge jump. GT3 was largely anticipated because of its colossal visual upgrades. its vastly improved vehicle sounds and physics. This level of sort of simulation felt like something that was impossible previously. GTA 3 literally created the modern open-world Western sort of action game design that many other games would follow in the coming years. The GameCube just wasn't impressive back then. The vibes were off. And that's where we get to the vibes part. The final part. There's this story which Nintendo fans love to tell about how many people became ex-Nintendo fans once they got into their teenage edgelord era, around when the GameCube released, and then when they became adults around the DS and Wii era, they fell in love with it once more because they were real adults and realized they were missing out on Nintendo. Except that's not why people were making fun of Nintendo during the GameCube era. This is why.
Cherish life and never waste.
Is this for toddlers? No, genuinely, who is this advertising to? I would rather have the Wii U advertisements over this.
Hot buttered popcorn, that's a deal!
Okay, maybe not. But do you see what I mean? And what were the edgy games that sold so well on the PS2? Like, okay, if we check the best-selling PS2 games, we have, like, GTA, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, mature games, yeah, hardly edgy. Then we have Gran Turismo, which is rated E for everyone because it's a fucking car game. Kingdom Hearts, also rated E. Dragon Quest VIII, and Tekken, and like, finally what? God of War, Battlefront. You practically have to go digging to find anything really edgy. Manhunt didn't even sell 1 million on the PlayStation. What's the edge here? Shadow the Hedgehog? That's on the GameCube as well. Those shitty BMX games with tits in them? Those were on GameCube too, with less censorship. The Punisher? Sure. Fucking okay, there were a few of them. But the vast majority of the games that were derided as edgy were just more mature than what Nintendo fans proclaim as nostalgia-worthy. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, to be clear, to like games that were more wholesome. But to proclaim that it was the edgelord system because it had games intended for more mature audiences and not for general audiences, it's just, you're just feeding the stupid Nintendo fanboy stereotype that isn't true, at least in modern times. But that doesn't stop some retro Nintendo fans from acting that way regardless. And oftentimes, they're the same ones who seem to deride the Switch 1 and 2 consoles. Go figure. And also, many developers of these franchises that went in a more mature direction did not go that way because there was some cynical marketing choice, but because they themselves wanted to make a game that was in a more mature sort of direction because that's what they were curious about. Guys who started coding in their early 20s back in the 90s were now in their mid-30s and still developing games. They wanted to try out something that felt new and fresh. That's why Jak 2 exists. And finally, let's talk about aesthetics. Now, to be perfectly clear, I grew up with a PC. For me, launching a game was double-clicking a desktop icon, and then putting the disc in if I forgot to install the no CD patch. But for the GameCube and PS2, these systems had other ideas. Let's take the GameCube's aesthetics, for instance. It was stylized, I guess. The purple cube shape, the colorful controller, the boot up animation, even the save icons were little cute animations. The PS2, though, it was very different. The black, sleek aesthetic, the boot up menu was so ethereal, futuristic. Granted, it's not like the GameCube didn't feel modern, but it felt sort of safe, like a toy. The PS2's menus were designed differently, I'd argue better. I don't know why the browser has a grey background, but like the actual memory card icons, for instance, were just way better conceptualized because they weren't icons, they were 3D. Okay, some developers were lazy, but others made actually really cute animated characters based on the games. Some of them even had special animations when you wanted to delete them, as if they were panicking of being destroyed. Also, mentioning storage sizes in kilobytes over blocks was always a nice benefit. The disc being shown is even a different color depending on what you put in. Yellow for DVDs, blue for CDs, or black for PS1 discs. While the GameCube felt like more of a continuation of the previous times of the N64 era, the PS2 just felt modern in comparison, and it just kind of made more sense. At the end of the day, the PS2 won because it was just more attractive, it had more games that people wanted, and had them earlier, it had more features, it was more aesthetically attractive at the time, and once you really get into the weeds, you can't even really claim the GameCube was superior on a technical level. The GameCube was good, don't get me wrong. But over the PS2 as your opponent, it makes sense that you are going to lose until some really special circumstances happen. To put it simply, the PS2 could launch nukes. The Xbox could survive them. The GameCube was a purple cube with a handle. Didn't even play full DVDs. Alright, that makes a lot of sense. I should have started with that. The video would have been a lot shorter to make.